We have to have an important discussion today. We have to have an important, probably one of the more difficult discussions that we have in this class. I'm a little under the weather, so you all have to help me out a little bit. But I wanted to put a disclaimer up first and foremost. Disclaimer, warning. This discussion is not an easy one to have. This discussion is kind of rough. I want to again put that disclaimer on the discussion. We have to talk about the phenomenon of lynching. First, I want to say just a couple things about how it fits into the time period. We talked about Reconstruction, sort of the politics of Reconstruction, how folks are reacting to this new society and whatnot. One of the things we emphasized was that people are tremendously fearful in the Reconstruction and post-Reconstruction era, trying to figure out what this society is going to look like. They're tremendously fearful about what their country is going to look like, what the South is going to look like after the war. There's just tremendous fear and almost hysteria in some ways. And as we know, when people are afraid, they'll do some crazy things. Probably no better example of the extremes that people might go to than to look at racial violence and gender violence, because it was really both, in the phenomenon of something like lynching. So I want to go through, have a discussion about lynching, have a discussion about it. I want to show you some sources on lynching, and this is doubly why I want to put the disclaimer out. Some of the sources that are going to be circulating around are maybe very difficult to look at, but I'm going to go through them anyway. If you have a problem with them, you are more than, it's okay with me if you don't look at the sources I'm passing around, or if you need to excuse yourself at any point from the room, that's okay today, because some of this stuff is that rough. But we have to talk about it. It fits in the context of the class on many levels. Part of what we've been talking about in this class is, we sort of started off with thinking about the social construction of race and class and gender, and how these categories get set up. You can argue in the Reconstruction period that these categories are getting set up all over again, right? That everything is kind of tipped, everything is kind of changed with the end of Reconstruction, and moving forward, people are trying to figure out what the place is going to look like. So just as we've argued that race and these other categories are constructed, they're made up, we've also argued that they may have very real consequences. Right? So we looked at, for example, the laws and how they set up the categories, but then we said, well, now it really matters which category you end up falling in. If you're seen as black or white in the society, it could mean your freedom. Lynching is kind of the same way. Yes, race is constructed, but folks are going to act on that to where it could ultimately cost you your life. And so these do have very real consequences. So again, difficult conversation. I want to put all the warnings out there. If you need to excuse yourself, if you're not comfortable with it, I understand that. Difficult subject. But it's a college classroom, so if we can't have this discussion here, there is no else that we can have it. So we have to have it. We'll see how it fits specifically into this time period and really moving forward. Explain sort of how I got interested in the subject, try to answer any questions that you may have on it. But again, especially in terms of the sources, I want to really strongly put that disclaimer out. I have two books I'm going to circulate around as we have this conversation. You can kind of take a look at it as much as you want. If you don't want to look at it at all, just pass it on to the next person. But I really wanted to put the warnings out on these two books. This book is called Without Sanctuary. What it is, essentially, is a book of photography, lynching photography. So this is one of the weird and yet interesting aspects of this phenomenon is not only were people killed violently, ritualistically, through this form of lynching, but folks took pictures of it, took pictures of themselves doing it. So again, if you can't handle those kind of images, I completely understand. You might not want to look at this one. If you do want to take a quick look at it, I put tabs on certain pages especially to look at that will inform our conversation. But again, this book in particular is very rough visually. So keep that in mind as it circulates. Right? Without sanctuary. This other book, small white book, is called 100 Years of Lynchings. 100 Years of Lynchings. Now this one is, in some ways, just as graphic, but no pictures. What this book is actually a collection of newspaper articles about lynching. So what happens is every time there's a lynching, the newspaper will report it. Sometimes they report it before it happens. They say, this afternoon at 2 o'clock, there's going to be a lynching. Everybody come on and show up. So in some ways, it's just as graphic because you're getting some of the description of it. But it's not the same for some in terms of looking at these kind of images. So again, there's some tabs on maybe some interesting ones. But if you don't want to read it, you don't want to look at it, that's up to you. Just let them circulate around the room. This discussion. So those are two of the sources we'll use to have this conversation. Those are two of the sources we'll use to try to define this phenomenon of lynching, to try to understand what it was, and really just as importantly, understand what it was not. Because I found that there were a lot of misconceptions around lynching too, what it kind of was and what it kind of wasn't, what its purpose was, especially in the post-Reconstruction South, and then what it was designed to do and what it didn't do. I also have a handout for you, but again, a couple quotes on there. Some of them are rough. We'll use that to go through our discussion here in a second. I guess the first I'll open up with a question. When you hear the term lynching, L-Y-N-C-H-I-N-G, when you hear that term lynching, what do you think of? I guess that's kind of where I want to start. What you sort of already know about the topic, what kind of comes to mind, what connotations you have of lynching in particular. So keep that question in mind. When you hear the term lynching, what comes to your mind? Any initial thoughts? I'll put some terms up too as we kind of go through here. First thing I guess I'll put up is lynching. I'll get the spelling of it and all that. When you see that term lynching, what comes to mind? Racism? Okay, definitely going to... Exactly, it has a strong component of racism to it. We'll see, it might have as much to do with gender as well, but definitely racism is probably the quintessential version of racial violence, in a sense. When you think racial violence, there probably is no better example in sort of our history than something like lynching. Anything else? Hanging. Hanging is one of the ways, specific ways that lynching was carried out, the way it was done. So yeah, we have this image of someone being hung, right? They're for whatever reason, either accused of a crime or accused of doing something that people in the town didn't like, right? And they might hang them. In the Old West, for example, cattle thieves or horse thieves might get lynched. But as we'll see in the South, especially in Reconstruction, post-Reconstruction South, this is going to become this racial phenomenon where you see African Americans getting strung up. I recently watched the recent James Brown documentary, and there was a scene in there where he kind of stumbles on a guy that's been lynched, and he kind of takes his shoes. The guy was just hanging out in the forest. We don't know anything about the guy or why he got lynched. We know he got lynched. James Brown kind of takes his shoes because he didn't have any. Kind of moves forward. Every now and then in more mainstream movies, you'll see a representation of lynching because it became so commonplace in the South at this time. Hanging wasn't the only form, but it was a major form. One of the things we'll see about lynching is it really had to do a lot with kind of an overkill, a a type of overkill, right? It wasn't just about killing somebody. It was about violently killing them, kind of torturing them, kind of dragging it out, kind of making an example of them. And you psych majors can help us in this discussion a lot today. We really want to figure out what's that about. And what's that about? If you're afraid of someone, you think they're going to do something to you when you kill them, that's one thing. But if you torture them and do some of the things that we'll talk about, it really says something, I think, psychologically about what's going on in the society. And that's what we want to figure out, what's going on in the society, both for African Americans and for those that are reacting to them in this very violent way. So that's why, what comes up? What else comes up when you hear lynching? Those are two good ones: racism, discrimination of various types, and pain. What else? Anything else? Or is that a good enough place to start? I'll tell you how I got interested in it. I was starting graduate school, actually back in 1998. There's a very famous lynching of a guy named James Byrd. James Byrd is lynched in Jasper, Texas. That kind of freaked me out. I was like, wait a second, 1998, this is almost the 21st century. I had read about lynchings in the 1890s, but then to see this lynching happen in the 1990s was like, what's going on? It made me really rethink and go back and do a whole bunch of research. I read everything I could on the subject of lynching. I was going to do my dissertation on it for a while. It really kind of fascinated me for some of the reasons that we'll talk about. What happened to this guy, James Byrd, was he was a black guy in Texas. He gets kind of jumped on by these guys. They tie him to the back of their truck with a chain and sort of drive him around town until he's dead. It's like, why would somebody do that? You don't do that to your worst enemy. Why would you just do that kind of randomly? What was interesting about the James Byrd case, though, and comparing it to a lot of the historical examples we'll look at, is the guys get prosecuted. It turns out they're, affiliated in some way with these white supremacist organizations. They wanted to kill this guy, and they did. But they get convicted. What we're going to see in most of the cases in this period, people did basically the same thing, but didn't get convicted. Usually didn't even get charged. So in the 1890s, you pretty much knew you could lynch somebody, lynch an African-American person, and get away with it. So that's a major difference. At some point, something tips between the 1890s and the 1990s. And that's a good thing. At least you can, sort of count on the justice system to deem it a crime, whereas this was not the case early on. This was not the case early on. So that's going to be a major difference between the two, is how the justice system responds. Right? We're spending a lot of time thinking about Reconstruction and laws and the justice system and all that. There's going to be a major problem with the enforcement of lynching in this period. Most of the time somebody got lynched, they wouldn't prosecute anybody. When they asked the police or the coroners, on the coroner's death certificate, they would say, this person died at the hands of persons unknown. Died at the hands of persons unknown. So we don't really know who did it. That's kind of what the coroner would say. Now we know that's not true because people told stories about who did it, and from our evidence in front of us, people took pictures of themselves doing it. So you would think they'd been really easy to convict if they wanted to convict somebody of this, right? When you lynch someone and take a selfie, it says something. It shows that you're not really concerned with getting prosecuted. You're not really concerned with or afraid of the law coming after you. So that tells you something about the society that we're looking at. Again, think about the significance of lynching, not just the fact that folks are going to be killed, but the larger significance of it. So again, the James Byrd case kind of started it off for me in the 1990s. So I tried to read everything I could. Found out there were several sort of recent lynchings. There was a guy named Matthew Shepard out in Wyoming, I believe. He was gay. Folks beat him to death and left him pinned up to a fence. They said kind of as a sign to what happens to gay people. Some say this was a lynching because he was targeted specifically because of his sexuality, not in this case race. He was white. Some say that was a lynching for that reason, contemporary lynching, because it was really meant as a larger kind of symbolic threat, essentially, to a larger group of people, like a terrorist attack. You make one attack, and it's really aimed at a larger group of folks. There was one in Virginia, one in Mississippi recently as well. There was an 18-year-old guy in high school, black guy, he was dating a white girl. Somebody didn't like that. He ended up dead. Got hanging in his front from a tree in his front yard, found hanging. His parents said he was lynched. Other people in the community said he had committed suicide, but since he was dating this white girl, they thought it had to do with racial stuff in the town. Again, it's interesting in some ways that they have happened more recently. We're going to be interested in the time period where they seem to explode. We're going to reach a lynching epidemic in the 1890s. Lynching epidemic. Interesting, same word that Malcolm Gladwell used to talk about tipping points, epidemic. Same word they used to talk about lynching in the 1890s. So again, that's how I got interested in actually some recent ones, and I tried to work my way backwards to try to figure out what is going on with this lynching stuff. What's going on with this lynching stuff? There are a couple of key terms. I'm going to put just a couple, not too many, but a couple of terms up here that will help us have this discussion about lynching. Ritual and spectacle. Ritual and spectacle. There was a whole ritual that was associated with lynching. Like I said, it wasn't just about killing somebody. We see killing every day, unfortunately, right? You get shot, stabbed, whatever. We've almost become desensitized to it. Turn on the news, you expect almost to see somebody get killed. But this was about a kind of whole ritual to the killing. For example, someone's accused of a crime, they kind of capture them or whatever. They want to get them to confess first. They usually would get them to confess publicly. So you got this mob, say, of 100 people. They got the guy tied up, and they say, okay, admit you did it. Right? Admit you did it. And they force the guy to admit he did it. They torture him a little bit to get him. It was almost like they had to get the confession before they felt okay killing him. A lot of it had kind of religious connotations to it. Think about this notion of confession, even in that sense. And you'll see this in some of the examples that you read of lynching. Almost this ritualistic kind of program. Like they knew a certain order of things to do. Which is weird when you think about it happening in different areas over different times. They seem to do them all the same kind of way. So that interested me, this whole ritual aspect. The spectacle aspect really, really interested me. Now spectacle, basically what we mean is kind of the visual significance. The spectacle of this. And you'll see this, the spectacle in the Without Sanctuary book that's circulated. Right? People taking pictures, right? Looking, people coming from all around, towns all around, to come see a lynching. So some of the pictures you see here, categorized as spectacle lynchings, could draw as many as 20,000 people. 20,000 people might come because they heard somebody was about to get lynched. Newspapers sometimes had advertisements. We caught, such and such. He's accused of this. Come down to the river at noon, and watch him be lynched. So 20,000 people come, watch this guy get publicly killed. So this kind of reflects in some ways on the definition of lynching. It's sort of hard to define, but there have been a couple of definitions given for this term, just to kind of make it understandable. So to lynch someone, you could say to seize them, to seize someone believed to have committed a crime. To seize someone believed to have committed a crime and put him or her to death without benefit of a trial. So you're killing them outside of the legal system. You can't think like, well, you know what, trial's not good enough for them. Trial's not good enough. So for example, in some of the lynchings that we'll see, you had somebody accused of a crime, they get thrown in jail. A mob develops outside the jail, and either the sheriff kind of gives them the keys to get the guy, or in a couple of cases, they run over the sheriff and take the guy, kidnap them out of jail, so they can lynch them publicly outside in front of everybody. So when you think about it, it's outside the legal system in a sense. That's part of the definition.
Seems like it's like a psychological factor tied to biology.
I want us to think a lot about the psychology. What is going on? I mean, it was hard for us to put ourselves in other people's shoes, right? And kind of think what other people are thinking and experiencing. But in this case, it's important. And it may not make sense. This is illogical on so many levels. But they had to be thinking they were doing something. to get 20,000 people all to do it together. I can see one or two, one of you, they're just crazy. You can't just say they're all crazy. There's something going on where they think they're doing something. We want to wrap our minds around what they thought they were doing, even as we condemn what they did, obviously. But yeah, the psychology of it is really, really, really important. Really, really important. So think about that. The lynching is outside the legal system. Right? It's not enough. Some people say, I can't wait for the legal system to run its course. Let's kidnap them out of jail, do it publicly. Some people say, well, lynching is really if 3 or more people kill somebody. So a group is taking and killing somebody, usually publicly. So keep those working definitions in mind. There's a problem with definitions, though. Even over time, a lot of the anti-lynching organizations, a lot of people like Ida B. Wells, you read about in the chapter, probably the most important anti-lynching activist, talk about the numbers, how many people actually get lynched. Lower numbers, the lower estimates say about 5,000 folks are going to get lynched between 1880 and 1920, about 5,000. Ida Wells said no, it's more like 15,000, 3 times that number. Again, part of the difficulty is nobody got prosecuted most of the time. Sometimes there wasn't a body left. So the numbers might be skewed a little bit. Numbers might be skewed. That might seem like a small number, right? That might seem like 5,000, 10,000 people. I mean, there were 4 million people enslaved, right? But it wasn't just about the person getting killed. It's going to be about this larger message that's being sent out to the entire community, and that's what we want to think about. What's happening in this period that folks think lynching is a good idea, a necessary idea. So keep those questions in mind. So ritual, spectacle, it's definitely going to fit the rise of Jim Crow, the rise of segregation, and all that. Okay, that's a good starting point. That's a good starting point. I'm going to give you a handout. I'm going to go through a couple of these quotes. Again, some of these quotes are rough. Not any more rough than that without sanctuary book. But keep that in mind. We'll look at the first quote really quickly here. Everybody see this one? This one here? This one? You guys see this one? Start with the first quote. This is by an author named Leon Litwack. He's a historian of the South. He may come up in a couple of our videos. He was trying to get some sense of a definition or a description of lynching as well. That kind of explodes in the post-Reconstruction South. And this is what he came up with, very kind of poetic description of what lynching was to him. So he writes, the story of a lynching then is more than the simple fact of a black man or woman hanged by the neck. Right, as he said, the first thing that came to mind was hanging. That is going to be one of the major mechanisms used to lynch, but it wasn't the only one. They shot people, they stabbed them, they did all kinds of things to kill them. And usually multiple things. They might hang them for a while, then decide, oh, don't let them die too quickly. Right, pull them down and burn them. And crazy kind of stuff, but it was more about the torture in some ways. It's the story of a slow, methodical, sadistic, often highly inventive forms of torture and mutilation. Again, if you don't like violence, you can't hear it, feel free to cover your ears at this point. It's executed by fire. It's the red-hot poker applied to the eyes and genitals. Now, in addition to the racial stuff, there's definitely some sexual stuff going on here. They're talking here about burning people's eyes and genitals. Genitals are going to play an important role in here. You psych majors can definitely help us in terms of thinking about the sexual component of this. The stench of burning flesh as the body slowly roasts over the flames and the blood sizzles in the heat. Also, those of you looking at the Without Sanctuary book, you'll notice a lot of the pictures, the guys' zippers are down. Usually that indicated castration. That was a major part of lynching, was the castration piece. So they again here to make a reference to genitals. That's in it. We'll talk about some of the reasons why. If executed by hanging, it's the convulsive movement of the limbs, whether by fire or rope. It is the dismemberment and distribution of severed bodily parts as favors and souvenirs to participants in the crowd. Okay, now this is, talk about the psychology. It's one thing to hate somebody so much to kill them. I think it's a whole nother level to cut off pieces of their body and take them home. That's some Jeffrey Dahmer stuff, isn't it? That's extreme. As if killing them isn't enough. Some of these examples we have people in the crowd fighting over body parts, fingers, ears, and stuff. That's just mad. Why would you? Help me understand. What do you think's going on with this? Get 20,000 people out to watch somebody get lynched, and they're so into it, so hyped up, that they start fighting each other over fingers and toes and pieces of liver. I mean, this is. How do you make sense of that? Can we make sense of that? And you cite ranges. If you were to counsel one of the people from this mob, how would you even start that conversation? You have to start by asking what they thought they were doing. But this is what happens. They literally fought over people's body parts. You can find stuff online, mementos from lynching and whatnot. Just the fact that these pictures, in the books, many of them are lynching postcards. A lot of folks took pictures of it and then sent postcards to their friends. Wrote stuff on there like, look at the barbecue we had, right? Crazy sort of what people thought was okay. It was really crazy to think about it. Again, we also want to think, and ultimately we want to think, how is it that folks are going to survive this? Because this is as low as it gets. How is it folks are going to survive this and resist this and then find ways to move forward from it? Because people are going to survive it. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this African American history class. Whether by fire, rope, ears, toes, fingers, nails, kneecaps, bits of charred skin and bones. Such human trophies might reappear as watch fobs or be displayed conspicuously for public viewing. The severed knuckles of San Jose, for example, would be prominently displayed in the window of a grocery store in Atlanta. The San Jose case that they're making reference to is a really famous lynching case at the end of the 19th century, the 1890s, early 1900s, in Atlanta. What happened was this. Sam Hose got into an argument with his employer. He was working for the guy, thought the guy was ripping him off. Guy didn't like how Sam Hose talked to him. Sam Hose basically said, look, I'm a man, you're going to pay me. They get in a fight. Sam Hose won the fight, killed him. Labor dispute. So once the story starts getting told, though, throughout Atlanta and in the newspapers, it really spun into this whole crazy thing that Sam Hose attacked the guy, when he was sleeping, took advantage of him, killed him with an axe. This is the way the newspaper told the story and the way people started passing it and gossiping it. That he killed him brutally, that he raped his wife, although that didn't happen. That's the way the story got told. That's when the crowd got really, really hyped up. And this is an important part of lynching. The thing that got people going more than anything else was the accusation of rape. The 1890s, we see the explosion of what they call the myth of the black male rapist. Myth of the black male rapist. There's this idea that all of a sudden, these free black men, now that they're all free, are all a bunch of rapists. They're not the good old, happy slaves from before. Now they're rapists. You've got to do something to them to defend white Southern women from all these rapists. So all of a sudden, this stereotype is created, it seems, in the 1890s. And lynching was used primarily, the primary excuse given for lynching was rape. They said, we got to lynch these guys to stop them from raping women. It's not enough to let them go through the court system. You got to lynch them so other people know not to do it. In fact, one white woman named Rebecca Felton in Atlanta also, she said, Rebecca Felton, she says we should lynch 1,000 African Americans a day if it'll protect white women. Her thing was, I don't care what you do, as long as you protect white women. Chivalry. Remember, the South is trying to get its honor back, right? After losing the war, it's trying to reclaim its masculinity in a sense. And these men are saying, we're going to protect women. It's chivalry, right? So think about how race and gender are working together. In order to be men, they feel like they have to punish these men. They feel like they have to protect white women. What's interesting, and we'll get into more of this, I would argue they're not just trying to control African Americans. These white men were not just trying to control African Americans. They were also trying to control white women. Because white women in this period are starting to do things that are making white men very nervous. As we already talked about, going way back to the Virginia laws, sex across the color line is always something that's made people nervous. Way back in the 1600s, we saw the Virginia laws. There's still a lot of that going on. Folks are free now to say, I've always liked you. Let's get it together. Sometimes folks are doing it consensually. Women are also doing things like trying to vote in the 1890s. Remember, women don't have the right to vote. But there's a whole women's suffrage movement. A lot of women are saying, well, I need you. It's a white man. They're saying, if I could vote, I can get my own job. I don't really need to rely on you. This is very scary for traditional men in this society. So I would argue that they're also trying to control these women at the same time they're trying to control this newly freed African American population. Again, this myth of the black male rapist is going to be key to this conversation. I'll give you an example. Ida Wells again. Ida B. Wells, later Ida B. Wells Barnett. The most important anti-lynching activist. Ida B. Wells was a school teacher in Memphis, Tennessee. She was a school teacher. She taught school in Memphis. She got into some trouble because she recognized that the schools for African Americans were horrible, and they were purposely kept that way, and so she protested essentially against the bad public schools, and she got fired as a school teacher. She was like, okay, whatever. She had turned to journalism anyway, and was going to use the pen, write articles and such, to try to help African Americans. So she had become a journalist. Ida Wells lived in Memphis. She talks about how before 1892, although she was African American, she talks about how she kind of believed in the myth of the black male rapist up to 1892. She said, I heard about people getting lynched, and I just thought, oh, well, they must have done something. Right, why would this crowd go to this extreme? They had to be rapists. Only rapists get lynched. What happens in 1892, she uses the ticket. Interesting, because 1892 was the year with the most lynchings of any year. 230 people got lynched that year. So almost somebody every other day was getting lynched in 1892. But for her personally, what happened was 3 of her friends got lynched. Ida Wells, again, is a school teacher. She was actually godmother to the child of one of the guys. These 3 guys get lynched. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDowell, Will Stewart, the 3 guys' names. Now again, the stereotype was rapists, right? Lynch rapists. She knows these guys. She's like, none of these guys are rapists. They're not outlaws, they're not criminals. In fact, they were businessmen. These 3 African Americans had opened up a grocery store, called it the People's Grocery Store, to get good prices, good quality, and they were actually doing better business than the white grocery store. Folks didn't like that competition, right? Economic competition. So they attacked this grocery store. The guys came with guns. Will Stewart, Thomas Moss, and them are like, oh, no, we're going to defend our store. So they got the pistols out. They said, it's not going to be a shoot-in, it's going to be a shoot-out. So when they started shooting at them in the grocery store, they shot back. They were better shots. A couple guys got killed that were trying to break into the store and destroy it. Ultimately, they get overwhelmed. Some of the guys in the mob were actually in the police force, so couldn't call the police. They get overwhelmed, they take them out, and they lynch them. They ask one of the guys, what his last words are. He says, you know what, tell my people to get out of Memphis. There's no justice for you here. So they get lynched not because they're rapists, because they're businessmen. Ida Wells is like, wait a second, I need to reevaluate this whole lynching idea then. I need to reevaluate what's really going on with this lynching stuff. Is it really about rape? What Ida Wells did was she did her own investigations. She started reading all these articles in newspapers, read everything she could on lynching, all the articles. She went undercover a few places and talked to people about lynchings that had happened in their towns. And she found out some really, really interesting things. One of the things she found out was that despite the fact that the excuse for lynching was the black male rapist. She found out that most people lynched were not killed because of rape. Most people that got lynched were not killed because of rape. In fact, not only were they not guilty of rape, she found out that in less than 20% of the cases, they were not even accused of rape. She's like, well, this doesn't make any sense. The overwhelming majority of the excuses are, okay, these folks are raping folks, so we got to lynch them. She says, you're not even really accused, were they not guilty, but only 18% of those were even accused of rape when they get lynched. So what could you get lynched for? Anything. People got lynched for Sam Hose fighting with their employer. Some folks might get lynched if they didn't drop the sidewalk quickly enough when a white person came by. If you burned down a barn, weren't working hard enough, talk back, look somebody in the eye. You get lynched for all kinds of things in the Jim Crow South. So she says, she came to the conclusion this is not about rape. This is about power. It's about racial power, economic power, political power. If somebody tries to vote, they get lynched. Got nothing to do with rape. That's just the excuse. The excuse given. So she really explodes this whole idea about lynching. Says it's not about rape. So Ida Wells writes an article in 1892, and she basically says, look, you guys need to quit tricking. Put it in contemporary terms. She basically writes this article to white men. She says, you know what? If you look too closely, you're going to see that a lot of these relationships between white women and black men are consensual relationships. She said, basically, you're going to get your feelings hurt if you really look at this. Just for asserting that there might be consensual relationships between white women and black men, they want to kill Ida Wells. Put a price on her head. They went to her printing press, burned it down. Fortunately, she's ahead of the mob. She would leave Memphis, leave the South, and move to New York and Chicago ultimately, because they chased her out of town. They wrote an article in response to Ida Wells' article saying, initially she writes under a pseudonym, a pen name, and they wrote an article in response saying, whoever wrote this article saying that white women and black men are sleeping together, they should have a certain, they should undergo a certain surgical procedure with a pair of tailor shears. Tailor shears are real big scissors. They said, whoever wrote this article, we should get some tailor shears and do some surgery on them. So basically castrate them. They thought it was a male that had written the article, even though she's a woman. So she writes the article, she has to leave and go up north. But she would continue as an anti-lynching activist for the next 30, 40 years. Until her death in 1931. So it's interesting. She's going to explode this whole myth of the black male rapist. Now Wells is like, well, wait a second. On some levels it makes sense. Why all of a sudden are black males all rapists now in 1890 when they weren't rapists in 1860? You had all kind of black males on plantations. Or during the Civil War, when all the white men in the South have to leave and go fight. You still got black men on plantations, many of them working for white women. Why wouldn't they take that opportunity if they were rapists? They're these animals. Go crazy right there. That would make more sense. Because they're not. Because this is made up. So she's really important in terms of exploding this stereotype. But it doesn't go away. Right? In many ways, the idea of the black male rapist as a rapist is going to outlast this time period. It's going to outlast this time period. But Ida Wells is particularly important for that reason. Now, there are a couple of important things about lynching racially and regionally. You need to understand it racially and regionally. What do I mean? Well, there is an important tipping point with lynching. Important tipping point. So I'm going to give you some statistics and see if you can answer a question for me. Talk about these black males getting lynched, right? Black men are going to be getting lynched tremendously in the 1890s. Yet that was not always the case. By the 1880s and 1890s, the overwhelming majority of lynching victims are going to be black men. Overwhelming 90 to 95% of lynching victims in the 1880s, 1890s are black men. That was not always the case. Before the Civil War, before 1865, most lynching victims were not black. Most lynching victims would have been whites, and in the West there were lynching of some Asians and some Latinos, but mostly whites. Why? Why do you see a dramatic shift in lynching victims from before the Civil War and after the Civil War? Reconstruction basically is the tipping point. Why do you think that there, let me ask it a different way, why are there so few African American victims before 1865?
I guess ultimately emancipation makes them targets.
Exactly. Said emancipation makes them targets. Remember, before emancipation, they were property. They belonged to someone else. There was a whole system of racial slavery in place that supposedly told everyone where they stood in society, right? The white, you're here, the black, you're there. Even the poorest white person, in many respects, is above the highest black person, right? All of a sudden, that system is wiped out. It's gone. Folks are reconstructing. They're trying to figure out what's next. So everything's thrown into chaos, tension, hysteria, fear. So in some ways, emancipation or freedom makes them targets. If you lynched somebody slave before 1865, you had to pay them for their property, even in the government. You executed a slave, you had to pay the owner. Folks didn't want to pay. But now, when you're free, you don't have to pay anybody. You're just to be victimized. So, racially, it's important to think about how it's going to be mostly non-blacks before the war. White Republicans come south, they might get lynched. Klan and other groups did that all the time. But by the 1890s, it's 90 to 95% African American. There's also a regional component to this. Lynching was a national phenomenon. It happened in the West. You'll hear stories about horse thieves and cattle thieves getting hung in the West, or there were lynchings in the North. There's a famous one in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, Zachariah Walker in 1918, and other places. But by the 1890s, it is overwhelmingly a Southern phenomenon. More than 90% in the South. Again, for our purposes, we can think about why. Where the majority of African Americans living at this point? The South. 90% plus of African Americans live in the South well into the 20th century. So if you're looking for a specific group of people, that's where you're going to find them. But it's interesting to think about how that shifts, how that changes over time. It becomes a Southern phenomenon. It was not always a Southern phenomenon. Texas had a huge number of lynchings, especially of Mexican Americans right there on the border. So the racial and regional components of lynching are important. Think about this in terms of the overall context of Reconstruction. I'm going to argue that there's class dynamics to it too. But the first thing I want to do is back up a little bit. Think about gender. The black male rapist is the ultimate thing to be feared, and lynching is supposed to stop that. And Ida Wells was good about pointing this out. If you're justifying lynching by saying we have to protect white womanhood at all costs, and this is what people said openly, we have to protect white women, it doesn't matter, do whatever you need to do to protect white womanhood. Chivalry, the idea of chivalry or protection of women. Not that you should protect women, but this goes to a racial extreme. If protecting womanhood is the big idea, how do we understand some of these other aspects of lynching? For example, many lynchings you'll see in pictures here. You'll see men in the photographs. You'll see women in the photographs. You'll see children in some of these photographs. If, for example, a woman was accusing a black male of rape, she would often be kind of led up to the head of the mob. She might fire the first shot, kind of thing. Her brothers and father would probably participate in the lynching, these sort of, protection, kind of patriarchy, these ideas. But if you're thinking about, women are these delicate flowers, are you really going to want to bring them to a lynching and watch somebody get body parts cut off? Does that make sense? If it's about protection of women. But what about children? There are some stories of little 3-, 4-year-old kids being brought to watch lynchings. Really, really interesting psychologically. I ended up thinking a lot about, especially that part of it. What's going on with this psychologically? I would argue that there's just as much going on within the white imagined community, within the white group. There's as much going on within the mob as there was with the victim. For example, a lot of times white children were sort of being educated. Sociologists would use the term socialization. Right? Socialization basically refers to learning your place in society. Right? How is it that you learn your place in society? Socialization. How do you learn how you're supposed to behave, how you're supposed to carry yourself publicly, what your role is, what other people's roles are? Lynching was a form of racial socialization. Right? You learned about black and white, and we talked about how these categories are constructed. Yeah, they're constructed, but one of the ways they were constructed was through violence. So if you're the poorest white person and you see a wealthy black person get lynched, you're glad you're not black. At least there's hope one day you can get some money, right? You'll never be that. So one of the best ways to teach people that are kind of rich, black and white in these other categories was through something like this. So this is why I would argue they brought little kids. Look what happens to them, and this is how you treat African Americans, blah, blah, blah. Right? You're white, so this is not, this is how they taught them their place in society. In a very sick way, this is how they were socialized. And what about gender? We keep talking about chivalry, protection of women. The overwhelming excuse is, we gotta do something to these black males that are running around crazy. Right? There used to be these happy sandals under slavery, and now they're these dangerous, all these other things. Well, that doesn't completely make sense either if you look at the total group of lynching victims. The total group of lynching victims. So this is one of the parts of lynching that surprised me. Now, it is true that the overwhelming majority of lynching victims by the 1890s were black men. Overwhelmingly, 95% black men. But black women get lynched too. Black women get lynched too. And I was like, well, wait a second. That doesn't make any sense. If you're afraid of the black male rapists running around and doing stuff with stuff, why are you killing black women? How does that make sense? These women weren't raping women, right? So you know something else is going on with it. I did research on it. Not about, if we go with a low estimate of 5,000 lynching victims between 1880 and 1920, somewhere just under 200 were women. Just under 200 were women. But to me, just the fact that there was one shows you that it's not about this black male rapist, right? It's not just about the black male rapist. That's alone to excuse. Some of the pictures that you see in there are lynching of women. You see women hanging and such, right? Laura Nelson was one. Cordelia Stevenson is one. Example number 3 here shows you the lynching of one woman. We talk about why women get lynched. Double to number 3. Apprehended for allegedly killing his white employer, Luther Holbert, and his wife found themselves subjected to mob justice in Dodgeville, Mississippi. So once again, it started about a beef with an employer. Right? Luther and his employer got into a fight. Some 1,000 people stood and watched as the self-appointed executioners went about their business, engaging in the increasingly familiar ritual torture, mutilation, and murder. The fact that it's increasingly familiar says something, right? People know what to expect by 1904. They already know what's about to happen. Right? They already know what the program, the ritual is going to look like. The blacks were forced to hold out their hands. Again, this is rough stuff, so you need to listen. You don't want to listen next time. While one finger at a time was chopped off. Fingers were distributed as souvenirs. The ears of the murderers were cut off. Think about the overkill. They're not just killing these folks. They're just doing crazy stuff to them. It's way above and beyond. Holbert was beaten severely. His skull was fractured, and one of his eyes knocked out with a stick, hung by a shred from the socket. The most excruciating form of punishment consisted in the use of a large corkscrew in the hands of some of the mob. This instrument is bored into the flesh of the man and woman. They're just born into it and pulling out stuff. It's nasty. It's like it's so far above and beyond any kind of imagination that psychologically something has to be going on with this. I'd argue that they're dehumanizing these people. They're showing that, look, you don't even treat people like this. You don't treat your own, your worst enemy like this. They're dehumanizing them. They're treating them like animals. They're butchering them, basically. Treat them like animals. And now this happens to both Luther and his wife. Most black women that got lynched had some kind of connection with a black man. So they weren't lynched because they were rapists, obviously. Right? Because female rapists is very rare. But then too. But they're getting lynched because they have some kind of connection. So for example, your brother is accused of a crime, right? The mob comes to your house in the middle of the night, knocks on the door and says, "Hey, where's Joey?" "I don't know, he might be hiding in the back. They might know that you're hiding him. They might take you and lynch you. Or you might really be gone." Right? A lot of folks found out the lynch mob was coming, and they left town. I'm out. Right? "Okay, we can't find him. We'll lynch you." Usually you were kind of the stand-in, for a male relative. That's usually what happened. Sometimes it was women. Women would defend themselves. Say an employer tried to rape them. And they said, "No, you're not." Right? They stand them up a little bit. They say, "Okay, we lynch you." Or burn down a barn, or all these things. There were some women that weren't playing. Right? Do what you need to do. This last example is probably the roughest one I think I've come across. But I think it's a perfect example for thinking about the lynching of black women. It's the Mary Turner example. Again, this one is rough. This one is super rough. So if you need to cover your ears, cover them now. She was pregnant. I'll put that out there. She was pregnant. This is the most famous lynching of a woman, Mary Turner. This one happens in 1918. Give you some background on what happened. Basically, Mary Turner's husband got lynched. And again, we want to think about how is it that African Americans are going to respond? Are they just going to cower in the corner? No, Mary Turner's like, "You know what? I'm not having it. You lynched my husband. I'm calling out the law. You all go to jail. I know who did it, this and that." So the mob is like, "Oh yeah." They turn on her because she is threatening to prosecute them for lynching her husband. She says, "Look, I'm a citizen. It's 1918. We just finished fighting World War I, fight abroad to make the world safe for democracy. Maybe Mary Turner was inspired by some of that. I'm a citizen just like you. You're going to jail." So this mob turns on her. That was her only crime. The only thing she was accused of, not a crime, but the only thing she was accused of was threatening these whites with prosecution. She's pregnant. Mary Turner, in her 8th month of pregnancy, vowed to find those responsible for her husband's lynching, swear out warrants against them, and have them punished in the courts. For making such a threat, a mob of several hundred men and women determined to teach her a lesson. Again, this is where it gets rough. So if you need to cover your ears, do so now. After tying her ankles together, they hung her from a tree, head downward. Dousing her clothes with gasoline, they burned them from her body. Now remember, the whole mob knows she's not guilty of any crime. Her only crime was threatening to call the police. So it's not about guilt or innocence in this case, as in many cases in lynching. They burned them from her body. While she was still alive, think about the dehumanization of this. They literally are going to treat her like an animal. While she was still alive, someone used a knife ordinarily reserved for splitting hogs to cut open the woman's abdomen. The infant fell prematurely from her womb to the ground and cried briefly, whereupon a member of this Valdosta, Georgia mob crushed the baby's head beneath his heel. Hundreds of bullets were then fired into the body, completing the work of the mob. So they hang her, cut her open, burn her, and then shoot her hundreds of times. Why? Because she said, "I'm going to call out the law. I'm going to assert my rights as a citizen. You're not going to get away with killing my husband. Lynching is illegal. I'm as good as you," basically. There were a number of sculptures and things that were developed on Mary Turner, so you'll hear her name. The NAACP had several stories about it. It was a pretty famous case, and it's interesting because it's so late in the process. This is 1918. This is 20 years after the heyday of lynching. This tells us actually a lot about the process itself. Lynching goes on for a long time. The high point is 1892, 230 lynchings. But it would continue. It would slowly go, the numbers would slowly go down. But it kept happening. It's actually really interesting. I read a lot of stuff about the NAACP that picks up the anti-lynching case after Ida Wells starts it. Other organizations would come be founded to try to stop lynching. And many of them had this goal of, we're going to have 1 year with no lynchings. So every year they start off, this is going to be the year. Now we're going to have a full year with no lynchings. And then like March, somebody gets lynched, they're like, oh. They start again. We have a year with no lynchings. It doesn't happen for a long, long time, like long to the 1930s and 40s, in fact. You have a lynching every now and then. What's really interesting, too, is we think about this period, as the number of lynchings go down, the number of race riots will go up. So, for example, you have 230 lynchings in 1892. That's the highest one. But that doesn't mean things get better. Overall, it doesn't necessarily mean things get better. For example, 1908, there are about 97 lynchings, 89 black people and 8 whites. 1933, only 24, 28, somewhere in that range. So the numbers go down. But then you have all these race riots. 1899 Atlanta, major race riots. 1906 in Atlanta. 1908, 1898 in Wilmington, North Carolina, major race riots. East St. Louis, Springfield, Illinois. And what a race riot was at this time period, if we think of race riots now, the hood, we use the color, kind of getting mad and burning stuff down after something happens. In this period, race riots meant groups of whites going into the black community and just killing whoever was there. So you had groups of whites not just kill one person, but basically kill anybody they could find. 1919, they called it the Bloody Summer, 1919. There's so many race riots in cities around this country. African Americans are going to be targeted south and north. Chicago is one of the places that folks get attacked. New York. So it's not that the numbers went down. It's kind of like the violence changed. When just one victim. The numbers may have gone up, actually. Rosewood, Florida. Have you seen the movie Rosewood? That was about the major lynching that happened in that black town. Tulsa, Oklahoma. They used to call it Black Wall Street. A lot of wealthy, upper middle class African Americans that lived. They burned down the whole area. So it's not that things got better, but the violence would change. The most famous lynching is Emmett Till. Some of you may have heard of Emmett Till. How many of you heard of Emmett Till? Who was Emmett Till? Anybody know? Remember? Emmett Till was a 14-year-old boy. 14-year-old boy who gets lynched in Mississippi. 1954. 1954. So that's pretty late, right? Late in this whole process. Mary Turner's 1918. Sam Ho's in 1899. Emmett Till's 1954. What's interesting about this case is that, one, it's a teenager, 14 years old. What happened with Emmett Till was he really didn't know how Jim Crow worked in the South. He really didn't know how serious it was, how kind of real it was in Mississippi. He was from Chicago. He wasn't from Mississippi. So he goes on vacation, basically. He goes down to see some relatives. He stays with relatives in Mississippi, Money, Mississippi. And he has, he's from the North. He has black and white friends in the North. He's kind of bragging to his little friends, like, oh, yeah, I got a white girlfriend up north. What are you talking about? Oh, yeah, I got pictures of her. Maybe his little friend from school or something. He's showing off these pictures. And his cousins and others are like, oh, you're so brave. Why don't you go talk to the white woman in the store? It's like, okay. Just want me to talk to her. No problem. He doesn't realize the rules, unwritten and written rules of Jim Crow in the South say you don't do that. So he goes in the store, and there's different accounts as to what happened. He either said, bye, baby, to the lady working in the store, or he whistled at her or something like that. He leaves. They're outside talking, and there's some older black men outside. They kind of hear what happened. They say, one of his cousins, they say, your cousin's crazy. He said bye to the white woman in the store. The black guys outside are like, you did what? He said bye or whistled at her, whatever he did. They're like, you better get out of here. You're going to be killed. He's like, what are you talking about? I said, bye. What? They leave. Again, these local folks knew that was a lynchable offense at that point in that area. You don't do it. Unwritten rules of Jim Crow. Don't do it. Knock on his door. Later that night, his uncle, he was staying with his uncle, Rose Wright. Knock on the door. Open the door, two guys with guns are there. Say, we need the boy from Chicago. Take him. He's never seen alive again. They shot him, threw him into the Tallahatchie River, and tied a cotton gin fan to him so the body would sink down. And he's lynched, basically. Not publicly, not a spectacle lynching, but they lynch him because of his perceived transgression of Jim Crow. Why do that? He's a 14-year-old kid, right? But it was seen as such a transgression that you had to defend white women. Again, very illogical in a sense. He's so badly disfigured with the shooting and the water and all that, that he's unrecognizable. His face is unrecognizable. The way that they identified him was with the ring that he wore that had his initials on it. Now, this is significant on a number of levels. I want you to think about this in terms of African American history. Emmett Till's uncle, illiterate sharecropper, right, knew the rules of Jim Crow. He testifies against the men. They had this court in Mississippi. Everybody knew the guys were going to get off because it was Mississippi in 1954. He knew that he didn't testify against whites in court. Rose Wright said, I don't care, I'm testifying. They actually had to hide him out of state until the court date because people threatened to kill him before the trial. He said, I don't care. He goes in, testifies, points to the guys. They came, they're the ones that did it. Guys, get off. The guys admit doing it. In fact, they later sold their story to a magazine. A few $100. They said, oh yeah, we did it. Talked about how they did it, why they did it, all kinds of stuff. But this was the way the country worked, well into the 20th century. But the response is interesting. Think about the response of Rose Wright. Because I don't care that I could be killed. He testifies against them. Emmett Till's mother gets the body back. This disfigured, horrible, looking image of her child. She decides to have an open casket funeral. Open casket funeral. People are like, oh, man, you can't do that. She says, I'm going to have an open casket. She says, I want everyone to see what they did to my boy. I want everyone to see what they did to my boy. Thousands of people would come to the funeral and see this picture. The most prominent African-American magazine at the time, Jet Magazine, took a picture. It was on the cover, so you'll see this very crazy-looking, disfigured picture. Billions of people are impacted by this, and many actually joined the Civil Rights Movement in 1954 because of the Emmett Till case. A lot of folks are saying, look at how extreme this is. You're going to lynch a 14-year-old boy from Chicago. There's something wrong. He didn't rape anybody, accused any of that. A lot of folks talk about joining the Civil Rights Movement in 1954 as a result of this. So when we think about African American history and something like the low point of lynching, we always have to think about what comes after this. 1954, 1 year before the Montgomery bus boycott, a young minister, 25 years old, by the name of Martin Luther King, is going to make his name in the action movement. That was a major civil rights movement. So a lot of this stuff is connected in ways that we can think about, going all the way back to the 1890s. So think about the responses as well as the kind of extremes of something like lynching. Another probably some questions about this. There's questions will remind me of things that I forgot. But the main thing I want to do was give this kind of overview to give some definitions to debunk some of the myths about it, the myth that women didn't get lynched, and to think about its overall significance, particularly in the context of Reconstruction, but also moving forward. This is really a much bigger conversation around kind of race and gender violence in this time period. Anything that's unclear about this? Anything you want to know more about? Again, when I started studying this, I read everything I could on lynching. Between about 1998 2005, I read everything that was out there I could find on this subject. I thought I was going to be doing a dissertation on it initially. Particularly, I was interested in women. How are you going to lynch women if the whole excuse is black men? This doesn't make sense.
You can say 2005.
Yeah, that's what I was There have been some questionable ones since, even later than that. A couple of things have happened in Mississippi and Virginia that people are debating whether they're lynching or not. I think some of them as late as 2010, in fact. There was one in 2000, I think it was the one in Virginia where the guy hanging in the tree, and another one in Mississippi. A lot of times it has to do with high school age kids dating and these sort of people not liking black and white II veteran that survived World War II, comes back and then gets killed. We'll see that a little bit later or something that we'll study a little bit later. But yeah, there have been some contemporary examples of things that people relate to lynching. They may say, are they lynching or are they not? The big difference, though, and this is the big difference, is that now when lynchings happen, people usually get prosecuted. In the 1890s, the court system didn't really seem to care about it. Again, at the hands of persons unknown. That was the label put on it. Or, sometimes the sheriff was a part of the mob. Sometimes the sheriff was right there, here you go, take the keys, listen to this. You don't need to waste court time. Sometimes there were ministers in the mob. It's kind of weird when you think about, okay, because one of the stereotypes were, okay, lynch mobs were just pour away trash, doing this and that. There were sometimes bankers, judges, police officers. Think of that, a police officer in a lynch mob. Who do you call? You can't call the police. They're already there. So in some respects, it's not just bad that individuals would be willing to kill African Americans. African Americans had to reflect on the fact that the whole system wasn't going to help them, wasn't going to protect them. In fact, Ida Wells, again, is interesting. She says, you know what? If they're not going to protect you, protect yourself. Ida Wells had two responses, at least, to lynching. One of Ida Wells' famous quotes. Now, again, this is nice, we think of women as being demure, right, polite. Ida Wells said, a Winchester rifle deserves a place of honor in every black home. She said, you know what? One way to stop lynching? Shoot a couple folks. They come try to lynch you, make it hard for them. Self-defense. Sound like Malcolm X, 60 years before Malcolm X. She said, you want them to treat you as men? Make it a shootout instead of a shooting. She also said, you know what? If the system won't protect you, leave. She writes that Ida Wells would go first to the north, anti-lynching activism. Then she goes to England. And she tells England about what's going on back in the U.S. She says, you know what? The U.S. is a savage, uncivilized place. And the U.S. and England are doing a lot of business. Memphis in particular. Word gets back from England. People are like, what are you guys doing out there? You're burning folks and doing all this. We're not going to invest anymore if you don't stop this. After a while, there's actually a pause in lynching in Memphis for several decades because business leaders get involved and say, hey, you can't do this. It's hurting business. At one point, Ida Wells says, leave Memphis. Several thousand people actually leave Memphis as a result of Ida Wells saying. Some of the city fathers actually write to her and say, hey, can you stop telling people to leave because we need them to stay here, we need the labor, this and that. She says, look, if you're not going to protect them, we're going to go somewhere where we feel protected. So it's interesting, again, to think about how are people going to respond to this. What's going to be the best response? Next week, we're going to look at two of the major responses to Booker T. Washington and W.B. Du Bois, two of these major African-American leaders that are having to respond to this context of lynching. But different individuals would have different responses. Different individuals have different responses, ways to react. Other questions? Things that are not clear about what lynching was. Let's see. It seems to decline. The numbers decline. I don't say never. I think there were a couple of years, I forget which ones, in the 1930s or 1940s, they finally had, it's funny, they celebrate like in 1940, we finally had a year with no lynching. But then the next year they had like 10, and then maybe it stops. But what's interesting to me is that as the numbers decline, the numbers of race riots go up. So I think the total numbers probably stayed the same in terms of people getting killed. Maybe even gone up, because race riots are much bloodier in terms of the number of people that get attacked. But yeah, it does start to decline. By the 1920s, 1930s, there may have been 20, 30 lynchings a year instead of 230 like in 1930. Excuse me, like in 1892. So yeah, the numbers do decline. I don't remember when the first year without a lynching was. The latest stat I have here was 1933. There were 28 lynchings. But in 1919, there are 83 lynchings, but there are also about 25 race riots. So the numbers probably went up in 1919. It did go up. So it's hard to sort of figure what I would say about that is it's not just about the numbers. I've done a couple of presentations on lynchings and publicly, and people have come up afterwards and say, yeah, my grandfather got lynched. Or my grandfather lived in a town and they knew somebody that got lynched. And what it did was it terrorized everybody. Really what it was a form of racial terrorism. You terrorized one person, so the rest of the community would behave a certain way. Oh, he tried to vote? Lynch him. Then the other 1,000 black people living there would be afraid to vote. So it really was a way of terrorizing folks, making them be less active politically, less active economically, making them not mix racially. It was really a way of making an example of something. Kind of like terrorism. It's exactly what terrorism does. Terrorists know they can't blow up the United States completely, right? Or if they don't like the U.S. or whatever, they'll pick a certain target. Or you could use a different country, right? You pick a certain target to kind of make this larger statement. That's kind of what terrorism is, usually by a group that, that's a whole discussion. But it's similar. It's a racial form of terrorism. But again, I would argue that race and gender are both operating at the same time in that phenomenon. Other questions? They're good questions. You guys are making me remember stuff every time as you ask them. White women ever lynched? It could happen. Could happen on occasion. Again, this is a good contradiction to the rule in a sense, because again, the idea was about protecting white women. Mainly it could happen if the woman was not seen as a lady. Right now, upper class white women wouldn't happen. If they were seen as lower class, maybe mixing too much with African Americans, it could possibly happen. Usually they would beat them up or something like that, but lynching might be a bit extreme. But again, it wasn't just about gender or race, it was sometimes about class. So to be considered a lady, for example, you have to be considered a white woman of a certain class, background, or education level, not working class, not mixing sexually with anybody else. For a white woman to choose to mix sexually, for example, with African Americans, she would immediately be disqualified from being a lady. She was seen as a whore at that point. And then she might get lynched, because then she was kind of open to that. Just kind of taken off the pedestal at that moment, essentially. Now the flip side of that too, even a black woman that might be considered a lady, right, upper class, very refined, educated, could still find herself lynched because of her race. So it's hard to fit that category. That category of a lady was a constructed category. But there were some. A lot of this explodes around the time of Reconstruction, and sometimes in the West too. I read one story about a woman named Juanita in California. She was a Mexican American. She gets lynched in California. So regionally and racially, it could take on some different components, but women could be lynched, and white women could possibly be lynched as well. White men. One of the more famous white men that gets lynched is a guy named Leo Frank. He was actually Jewish. He was accused of raping a little girl in the factory that he worked in. So a lot of it had to do with the fact he was Jewish. He was white, technically, but Jewish was seen as less than white. A lot of anti-Semitic behaviors. One of the pictures in the book is a lynching of 11 Italian immigrants in Florida. Remember Italians coming over, aren't really seen as white yet in the 1890s. So this construction, this social construction of race is really at play there. Who's considered white and who isn't? Who fits the category, who doesn't? They might have been seen as a little closer to black than they might be now. It's a good question, though. All right, so think about how this all fits together, how it helps illuminate, say, the period of Reconstruction.